It's called our European Green Deal. It is our new and sustainable growth strategy. And when we set off, we knew that the road would not always be smooth, that as the global setting around us is constantly changing, we would have to constantly adapt to stay the course. But let me tell you, we did not know how bumpy this road would be. We had a pandemic with aftershocks that are still being felt around the world, across the world. Business has a tough time to really catch up again after this pandemic and the lockdowns. Russia unleashed an unprovoked, unjustified, brutal, atrocious war against Ukraine. And the spillover effects are global, from energy supply to the redrawing of global diplomacy. And now, and that's the reason why I'm here today, we see in parallel that we are confronted with an intensifying global clean tech race. In tackling all these new challenges, we always have to keep in mind the direction of our travel. It is towards a thriving, a clean and a competitive European economy, and this is what I want to talk about today to you. If we want to speak about that, let us first zoom out a little bit and bring you back in time a few years. It is exactly 3 years ago that we launched the European Green Deal. It was the very beginning of my mandate as President of the European Commission, and we decided that our first priority would be to decarbonize and digitalize the European economy. I called it our man in the moon moment, and it was really a moonshot. We were the first global power to set the path towards net zero emissions and to make it legally binding. You might remember at that time we had in the United States an administration in place that did not believe that humans caused climate change and announced to pull out of the Paris Agreement. China was heavily investing in coal, and Europe emerged as a global frontrunner. We said to ourselves, let's not wait to do what is right. Let's invest today in the clean technologies of tomorrow. Because eventually, if we do it right, all advanced and emerging economies will embark on the same journey. And we've stayed the course ever since. This has given certainty. It has given certainty to our industry, to our investors on the direction of travel. We have cast our goals in the first ever climate law. When the pandemic hit, we created Next Generation EU, not only to power the recovery, that was also important, but also to accelerate the digitalization and the European Green Deal. Just keep in mind that almost half of Next Generation EU, this is our 800 billion recovery plan, half of it contributes to our wider climate objectives. We developed a legal framework to cut emissions by at least 55%. And in parallel, we have worked with industry in strategic fields, from joint European projects on batteries or hydrogen to the European Chips Act. Europe has become the global hub of investment for clean tech and decarbonization. Now, if you now fast forward to today, first of all, there is some positive news. Europe is no longer alone in the fight against climate change. When President Biden came into office, one of his first decisions was to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And now the United States has taken the next step and passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The Inflation Reduction Act, called IRA, is an investment plan of roughly $369 billion to build up a new industrial ecosystem in strategic clean energy sectors. And there is a striking symmetry between the Inflation Reduction Act and our European Green Deal. Both of them are simultaneously a climate strategy and a strategy for investment and growth. Both of them include funding for just transition, and both of them include regulatory standards. So we have the two biggest and most advanced economies in the world that are now moving in the same direction. The United States relies traditionally on investment and regulatory standards, while we, the European Union, relies on a combination of investment and regulatory standards and carbon pricing. Two continent-sized powers are modernizing their economies by investing close to €1 trillion and addressing together the biggest challenges of our times. And this is so important. It is not only a positive signal for our planet, but also for our global investors. Yet, the Inflation Reduction Act is also raising concerns here in Europe against a very particular backdrop for our industry and economy. The first point is that COVID has exacerbated bottlenecks in many critical supply chains. The European industry has been carefully trying to fix the weak links of these chains in the last weeks and months and make them more resilient. But of course, this has come at a cost. The second element you are very familiar with, that is the global energy supply is tight because of Russia's war of aggression. You know it from the European Union. Just think of the fact that in the last 8 months only, Russia has cut 80% of the pipeline gas supply to the European Union. But, and this is important, we've been able to compensate. Something that is truly remarkable, 80% of the pipeline gas supply in 8 months. It is remarkable and it deemed impossible to many. But we should keep in mind in these 8 months there have been not only no blackouts in the European Union, but we also managed to fill our gas storages by almost 96%. So we are safe for this winter. But this comes also at a higher cost of energy for our industry and our SMEs. And all of this affects the competitiveness of many European industries, especially energy-intensive sectors of our economy. It is against this backdrop that the Inflation Reduction Act has received so much additional scrutiny in Europe and also in the rest of the world. There is a risk that the IRA can lead to unfair competition, could close markets, and thus fragment the very same critical supply chains that have already been tested by COVID. So we need to look at these issues closely and at the same time learn what we can do better. And in doing so, we need to look at 3 aspects that are particularly challenging in the IRA. The first one is Buy American. This Buy American logic underpins part of the IRA. The second difficult issue is tax breaks that could lead to discrimination. Some get them, others not. And the third element is production subsidies that could lead to a subsidies race. Now, this sounds all very technical, but it's easier to understand if I give you one example. If you are a consumer in the United States, you get a tax break when you buy electric vehicles, EVs, if they were manufactured in North America, and if you are a battery producer for those same electric vehicles, you get a tax break if you produce in the United States. So you get the essence. This means that a car manufacturer gets a double benefit for producing in North America and for buying parts in the United States. And what is more is that this could also attract critical components and raw materials towards the United States and away from the transatlantic supply chains. And you can imagine this creates, of course, first of all, an attractive, conducive investment environment on clean tech in the United States. But we already see how this could also affect Europe's own clean tech base by redirecting investment flows. And we've all heard the stories of producers that are considering to relocate future investments from the European Union to the United States. Now, I want to be very clear on one point. Competition is good. We like it. It's important. It drives innovation. It enhances efficiency. It ensures progress. And in doing so, it brings down prices for clean technologies. Competition between Europe and the United States can push both our industries to excel, to innovate, to transform faster, and all this is necessary. And this is why I believe in the need to invest into two clean energy industrial bases on both sides of the Atlantic. That is so important, that we see the dual approach. Not only will we create the well-paid jobs of the future if we do so, both in the European Union and in the United States, but we will also drive through this competition down costs for clean energy technologies globally. So together, the United States and the European Union, we can make clean energy more affordable worldwide if we work together. And by doing so, we will help, of course, decarbonize other economies and drive a just transition. But, you expected a but in all this, but this competition must respect a level playing field. And that's why it is so critical that the technology competition between the European Union and the United States is a race to the top for our industries on both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm confident that Europe is in a strong position to compete on global markets and develop the clean technologies of tomorrow. Now, will this be enough to keep up the clean tech race? Yes, if we are competing on a level playing field. So we must take action to rebalance the playing field where the IRA and other measures create distortions. In other words, we need to do our homework here in Europe, and at the same time, we have to work with the United States to mitigate competitive disadvantages. And I see three ways to do so. The first is we have to adjust our own rules to facilitate public investment into the transition. The second, we have to reassess the need for further European funding of this transition. And thirdly, we have to work with the United States to address some of the most concerning aspects of their law. To my first point, as I said, we have to adjust our own rules to make it easier for public investment to power this transition. State aid. State aid is a tried and tested tool here in Europe, and it incentivizes business activities for the public interest. Just to give you an example, last summer we approved 4.4 billion euros, 5.4 billion euros in state aid for the hydrogen valley chain. under one of our so-called IPCEIs, you know the abbreviation, Important Projects of Common European Interest. This public investment will benefit 35 companies from 15 different member states, from Portugal to Denmark, from Finland to Italy. And they will help bring new technologies from the laboratory to the factory for hydrogen production, for powered trucks, for storage, for hydrogen trains or hydrogen-powered ships. And this is only one of the many examples of our state aid policy at the service of clean tech. Yet the Inflation Reduction Act should make us reflect on how we can improve our state aid framework and adapt it to a new global environment. So we must look at how we can make our framework more predictable and more simple. Europe, as you know, has built a very sophisticated system, but business today is asking for a simple system and simple rules. Europe has built a very precise system, but business today wants state aid rules to be predictable above all. We are very careful to avoid distortions in our single market. It's very important. But we also must be responsive to the increasing global competition on clean tech. So we have to look at the global market. And if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it invests right along the value chain in some strategic sectors. And this is not always the case with our state aid. Our IPCEIs, for example, aim to bring breakthrough technologies from the laboratory to their first industrial deployment. That is good. But we now will also take a fresh look at how we can support the whole value chain down to the mass production of the most strategic green tech solutions and clean end products, including through public investment. Our state aid framework exists to preserve our very precious single market. But if we see that investment in strategic sectors are leaking away from the European Union, this would only undermine our single market. And that is why we are now reflecting on how to simplify and adapt our state aid rules. My second point has to do with the complementary European funding. While it is critical that member states have the flexibility to invest their budgets in strategic sectors, this approach cannot be self-standing. Because you can imagine if it's only about state aid, it would of course favor those member states that have deep pockets, the fiscal space. And that would lead to distortion of our single market and would eventually undermine our single market. Thus, we also need a common European answer to the challenge, both in the short term and in the long term. And in the short term, what we have to do is we have to bridge the difficult time for our SMEs and industries right now to transition towards cheaper and renewable energy all across the European Union. At the moment being, they're stuck in this energy crunch with expensive fossil fuels, and we have to support them or bridge the time so that they can transform and transition towards renewable energy that is the cheap energy, the homegrown and affordable energy. And here, Repower EU is our tool. Repower EU, we are just having it in the final negotiations in Parliament and Council to be approved till the end of the year. Repower EU invests in energy efficiency, in renewable energy massively, and in the infrastructure that you need to integrate the European Union, the interconnectors, the grid, for example. And what is important, Repower EU will massively speed up the permitting process for renewable energy projects. You might know that sometimes these projects need 7 to 8 years to be permitted. So our ambition is now to reduce that to below 1 year, to really have all these renewable energy projects that are in the pipeline up and running. We are now working on boosting Repower EU. Repower EU needs greater firepower to accelerate exactly this green transition. However, we also need to look beyond ad hoc solutions. The new assertive industrial policy of our competitors needs a structural answer from the European Union. And in my State of the Union address, I introduced the idea of establishing a sovereignty fund. The logic behind a sovereignty fund is simple. We need a common European industrial policy, and this common European industrial policy requires common European funding. The goal of our European industrial policy is for European industry to be the leaders in the clean tech transition. And this means, over the midterm, that we have to beef up the resources available for upstream research, for innovation, and for strategic projects at the European Union's level. In other words, this means, on one hand, new and additional funding at the EU level, and it means, on the other hand, higher level of policy coordination like hydrogen, like semiconductors, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, all these important topics. And on my third and final point, cooperation instead of confrontation. We are working very closely with the Biden administration on how to jointly strengthen our clean energy industrial base. And let me go back to the example I gave you earlier, the electric vehicles, the EVs. In Europe, we have just agreed to phase out the combustion engine by 2035. This means new vehicles sold after 2035 will be exclusively electric. Similar regulatory commitments exist in the United States. And at the same time, China is subsidizing massively this sector. So we, the United States and the European Union, have a vast common interest to preserve our industrial leadership. And this will require fundamental changes in the automobile industry. It will require significant private and public investments in innovation, in infrastructure, in supply chains and raw materials on both sides of the Atlantic. But it is not just about investment. It is also about setting standards and joining forces where it makes sense. Take, for example, the whole topic of the charging infrastructure for EVs. If Europe and the United States agree on common standards, it is us who will shape global standards and not leave it to others. Or take the topic of critical raw materials for clean tech that we urgently need. Today, the production and processing of some of these critical raw materials, without them, no green transition. Today, the processing and production is basically controlled by one single country, and that is China. Europe and the United States can build an alternative to this monopoly we see by establishing a critical raw materials club. The idea behind it is simple. It is cooperation with partners and allies on the sourcing, on the production, on the processing that gives us the ability to overcome this monopoly. So there you have two examples of standards or the raw materials to give you an idea what we are working on with the White House exactly right now. And finally, all this should be seen in a wider context. Let us zoom out again and focus on the bigger picture. An aggressive Russia is threatening our democracies and is blackmailing us with our dependency on fossil fuels. An increasingly assertive China is cultivating dependencies in all continents to project power of its own interests. But by contrast, look at what the United States and Europe are able to achieve if we join forces. Take Ukraine. Think of the immense impact of our sanctions. Think of how much support we have mobilized together from our countries and the world to help Ukraine in the last 9 months, this brave and courageous people. Look at us joining forces to dry out Russia's war chest by just now introducing a Russian oil price cap globally. Let me tell you that since the end of the Cold War, never has the transatlantic cooperation been closer as in those 2 last years. We have ended long-standing disputes on steel tariffs, on Airbus Boeing, on securing data flows. We have created a Tech and Trade Council to cooperate on tech and trade matters. We have set up this spring a task force on European energy security that led to additional deliveries of 15 billion cubic meters of LNG this year. And remember, I told you that 80% of the pipeline gas has been cut. So in the first half of 2022, the United States supplied more than three quarters of the EU's additional needs. And on climate, we have brought together over 100 countries to sign the Global Methane Pledge, a commitment to cut global methane emissions by 30% in this decade. These are just examples what we are able to do if we join forces, the power of transatlantic partnership. And therefore, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, this is my message to you as you embark on this journey at the European Diplomatic Academy or as students here in Bruges. There will always be times where new challenges emerge and old tensions rise back to the surface. This can be the case with rivals and competitors, or even with your oldest and closest partners. But as you will learn in this next year, Europe will always look for solutions that are crafted by cooperation and designed by diplomacy. And of course, Europe will always do what is right for Europe. So yes, the European Union will respond in an adequate and well-calibrated manner to the Inflation Reduction Act. But does this mean that we will engage in a costly trade war with the United States in the middle of an actual war? This is not in our interest, and nor in the interest of the Americans. And it would harm global innovation too. So that is the reason why we're working so hard in Europe and the United States now to precisely address these distortions. In the last 2 years, the EU and the United States have shown that we are stronger individually when we stand together collectively. When we focus on what binds us, our values, our friendship, our belief in fair competition, our belief in open markets, and of course our belief and commitment to the rules-based order. For friends like us, competition and cooperation can be two faces of the same coin. So let us strengthen clean investment on both sides of the Atlantic. Let us do it for our people, for our industries, of course for affordable clean energy worldwide, and for the sake of our planet. Thank you very much for listening, and long live Europe.